Picture this. You're a simple shepherd, living in a quiet village where the days blend into one another, tending sheep, caring for fig trees, listening to the hum of the wind. Life is predictable, peaceful, but one day out of nowhere, a voice calls you. Not just any voice, but the voice of God. And it's not a call to stay comfortable. It's a call to leave everything behind, stand before kings, and speak a truth so bold it could shake an entire kingdom. Would you answer that call? This is the story of Amos, a man from the tiny village of Tekoa, who went from herding sheep to becoming one of the most powerful voices in biblical history. In the next 20 minutes, you'll discover three things: how an ordinary man found the courage to confront a corrupt kingdom, why his message of justice still echoes today, and what Amos's journey can teach you about standing up for what's right. But before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever felt a nudge to do something brave, something bigger than yourself? Maybe it's speaking up for someone who can't, or challenging something that feels wrong. Hold that thought, because Amos's story might just inspire you to take that step. Let's step into the hills of Tekoa and uncover the story of a shepherd who changed the world. Let's step into Tekoa, a tiny village tucked away in the heart of Judah, where time seems to stand still. This is no bustling city with grand palaces or crowded markets. No, Tekoa is a place of quiet beauty, golden hills stretching as far as the eye can see, dotted with grazing sheep and ancient fig trees that whisper secrets in the wind. It's the kind of place where life moves to the rhythm of the seasons, where the bleating of lambs and the rustle of leaves are the loudest sounds you'll hear. This was Amos's world. He wasn't a scholar or a priest. He wasn't known beyond these hills. Amos was a shepherd guiding his flock through the rocky paths, and a keeper of sycamore figs, coaxing fruit from the stubborn trees with skill and patience. The Bible tells us in Amos 7:14, "I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees." That's who he was: ordinary, unassuming, his hands rough from work, his heart tuned to the quiet of the land. But there was something special about Amos. Long before God called him, he had a heart that noticed the little things. They say in Tekoa, he once stopped to help a poor traveler who'd been robbed, sharing what little he had. That was Amos, someone who saw injustice, even in the smallest moments, and couldn't look away. The people of Tekoa had their own stories about this place. They whispered that the fig trees here were sacred, that their leaves carried messages from God, rustling with divine secrets when the wind blew just right. Some even said that shepherds like Amos, alone on the hills, could hear God's voice in the stillness, a voice that chose the humble to do great things. Tekoa was Amos's home, his sanctuary, but it was also the place where everything was about to change. Because one ordinary day, as the sun rose over these hills, a call would come, a call that would pull Amos from the quiet of Tekoa and send him into the heart of a kingdom on the brink of ruin. What happened on that day? Let's find out as we follow Amos to the moment that changed his life forever. Imagine a morning like any other in Tekoa. The sun climbs slowly over the hills, painting the sky in hues of gold. The air is filled with the soft jingle of sheep bells and the rustle of fig trees swaying in the breeze. Amos is out with his flock, his eyes scanning the horizon, his heart at ease in the familiar rhythm of his world. He's just a shepherd, a man of the land, far from the noise of cities or the halls of kings. But this day, this ordinary day, is about to become anything but. Suddenly, Amos feels it, a weight on his heart, like a fire kindling deep within. It's not a voice you hear with your ears, but one that echoes in your soul. The Bible tells us in Amos 3:8, "The lion has roared. Who will not fear? The Lord has spoken. Who can but prophesy? That's what Amos felt. The roar of God, calling him to a mission he never could have imagined. God wasn't asking him to stay in the quiet hills of Tekoa. No, he was sending Amos to Samaria, the glittering capital of Israel, to confront kings, priests, and a kingdom drowning in corruption. Can you imagine the weight of that moment? Amos, a man with no titles, no training, thinking, me? Why me? Yet there was no turning away. The call was undeniable, like a spark that wouldn't fade. They say in Tekoa, shepherds sometimes saw a strange light on the hills at dawn, a sign, the villagers whispered, that God was choosing someone for a sacred purpose. Maybe Amos saw that light, or maybe it was just the fire in his heart. But he knew his life was about to change forever. So Amos set out, leaving the peace of Tekoa behind. What awaited him in Samaria? A kingdom of dazzling wealth and a darkness that would test his courage to its core. As Amos left the quiet hills of Tekoa behind, he stepped into a world that couldn't have been more different. Samaria, the crown jewel of Israel. Picture a city bursting with life, palaces that sparkled under the sun, markets overflowing with exotic spices and fine silks, and laughter echoing from lavish feasts. In the 8th century BCE, under King Jeroboam II, Israel was at the height of its prosperity, a kingdom that seemed untouchable. To an outsider like Amos, it must have felt like walking into a dream. But beneath the dazzle, there was a shadow. For every merchant draped in jewels, there was a farmer who'd lost his land to unfair taxes. For every grand temple ceremony, there were children scavenging for scraps in the alleys. The Bible captures this stark reality in Amos 5:11. You trample on the poor and force them to give you grain. The wealthy lived as if nothing could touch them, while the poor were crushed under their greed. And the religion? It was a hollow show. Sacrifices piled high on altars, but hearts far from God. Let me tell you about a man Amos might have seen, a farmer named Eli, whose fields were taken when he couldn't pay the king's taxes. Eli stood in the marketplace, watching the rich pass by, his hands empty, his hope gone. Stories like his were everywhere in Samaria, hidden behind the city's golden facade. Amos saw it all, and it stirred something deep within him, a righteous anger, a fire that would soon blaze. The people of Samaria had their own whispers about their city. Some said the palaces were built on a curse, their foundations laid with the tears of the oppressed. Old stories told of shadows moving in the temple at night, as if God himself was turning away from the empty rituals. Whether these tales were true or not, one thing was clear. Samaria was a kingdom ripe for judgment, and Amos was walking straight into its heart. Amos had come to Samaria not as a visitor, but as God's messenger. What would he say to this city of splendor and sin? His words were about to shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Here stands Amos, a shepherd from the quiet hills of Tekoa, now in the heart of Samaria's chaos. The marketplace hums with life, merchants shouting, coins clinking, the scent of spices heavy in the air. But Amos isn't here to buy or sell. He's here to speak, and his voice is about to cut through the noise like thunder. Imagine the courage it took for this ordinary man, with no title or power, to stand in the shadow of Samaria's grandeur and proclaim a message that no one wanted to hear. Amos begins with a roar, his words drawn straight from God's heart. The Bible captures it in Amos 1:2. The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. He starts by condemning the sins of Israel's neighbors, Damascus, Gaza, Moab, calling out their cruelty and injustice. The crowd nods, maybe even cheers, thinking, yes, judge them. But then, like a lion turning on its prey, Amos points directly at Israel. You who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, he declares, his voice steady but fierce. Your time of reckoning is coming. He paints vivid pictures with his words. In Amos 4:1, he calls the elite cows of Bashan, a bold, almost shocking metaphor for those who live in luxury while exploiting the poor. He speaks of dishonest scales in the markets, where merchants cheat the hungry, and of altars piled with offerings that mean nothing because their hearts are empty. But his most powerful cry comes in Amos 5:24. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. It's a call not just to stop sinning, but to live lives that overflow with fairness and compassion. The people of Samaria had their own stories about moments like this. They whispered that when a true prophet spoke, the air grew heavy, as if the winds themselves held their breath. Some swore they felt the ground tremble under Amos's words, a sign that God was near, watching. Whether these tales were true, one thing was certain. Amos's message wasn't just words, it was a fire, burning through the lies that held Samaria together. Amos's words struck like a blade. Some in the crowd grew uneasy, their consciences pricked. Others scoffed, dismissing him as a nobody from nowhere. But for a few, the forgotten, the oppressed, his voice was a spark of hope, a promise that God saw their suffering. And Amos wasn't done. God had more to show him, visions that would make his message even clearer. What did God show Amos next? Visions so vivid, so terrifying, they would shake even the hardest hearts. Let's follow him into the revelations that would define his mission. After Amos's bold words shook the marketplace of Samaria, he stepped away from the crowds, seeking solitude on the quiet hills. The city's noise faded, replaced by the whisper of the evening breeze. But God wasn't finished with Amos. Out here in the stillness, he sent visions, vivid, terrifying images that burned into Amos's heart, revealing the fate awaiting Israel. These weren't just dreams, they were divine warnings, and Amos felt their weight like a stone in his chest. The first vision was a plague of locusts, sweeping across Israel's fields like a dark cloud. Every stalk of wheat, every vine, gone in moments, leaving nothing but dust. The Bible records this in Amos 7:1-2, where Amos cries out, "Sovereign Lord, please forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small." It was a picture of famine, of a people stripped bare by their own sins. Amos, with a shepherd's heart, pleaded for mercy, and God relented, for now. But then came a second vision, even more fearsome. A fire so fierce it devoured the land and even the depths of the sea. Amos 7:4-5 tells us he begged again, "Sovereign Lord, I plead, stop. How can Jacob survive?" This fire wasn't just destruction, it was God's judgment, burning away the corruption that festered in Israel. Again, God heard Amos's cry, but the message was clear. Time was running out. The third vision was quieter, but no less chilling. Amos saw God holding a plumb line, a tool builders use to check if a wall is straight. In Amos 7:7-8, God says, "I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer." Israel's heart was crooked, its foundations crumbling under greed and injustice. This time, Amos didn't plead. He knew judgment was coming, and his role was to warn. The people of Samaria whispered of strange signs when prophets received visions. They said the hills trembled, or sudden storm would sweep through, as if the heavens themselves were speaking. Some swore they saw a shadow pass over the city when Amos stood alone, a sign that God's eyes were fixed on Israel. True or not, these stories captured the awe of that moment. Amos, a shepherd, carrying the weight of divine truth. These visions weren't just for Amos, they were a final call to Israel. But speaking truth to power would come at a cost. What happened when Amos faced the might of Samaria's elite? Let's find out. Amos had shaken Samaria with his words, his visions of judgment ringing in the ears of the powerful. But now he stood at the heart of Israel's religious power, Bethel, the king's sanctuary, where faith had become a performance. The air was thick with incense and pride, but Amos wasn't here to bow. He was here to challenge, and that challenge was about to spark a fire. Enter Amaziah, the high priest of Bethel. He was no ordinary man. He guarded the temple's prestige, a symbol of Israel's wealth and control. To him, Amos was a threat, a nobody from Tekoa daring to call out the kingdom's sins. Amaziah acted fast, sending word to King Jeroboam II, accusing Amos of treason. The Bible tells us in Amos 7:10, Amaziah said to Amos, "Get out, you seer. Go back to Judah and prophesy there." He tried to dismiss Amos, sneering at his humble roots, as if a shepherd had no place in Bethel's sacred halls. But Amos didn't flinch. With a voice like stone, he answered, "I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from the flock and said, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" Amos 7:14-15. It was a declaration of divine authority, a reminder that God's call outweighs any human power. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Amos wasn't here by choice. He was sent, and no priest could silence him. The people of Bethel had their own tales about such moments. They whispered that, when a true prophet spoke, the wind stirred as if God himself was present. Some swore they saw the temple's golden idols flicker, their shine dimming under Amos's gaze. Whether these stories were true, they captured the truth. Amos's words were shaking the very foundations of Bethel's power. Amos's stand divided the people. Some mocked him, siding with Amaziah's authority. But others, those weary from injustice, felt a spark of courage, as if God was speaking through this shepherd. Yet even as Amos faced down power, God had one more message for him, a message not just of judgment, but of hope. Amos had stood firm, but his mission wasn't over. What new vision would God share? A promise to lift Israel from its ashes. Let's find out. Amos had delivered God's warnings, visions of locusts, fire, and a plumb line that measured Israel's failures. His words had shaken Samaria, stirring anger and fear. But God's heart is never just judgment, it's also restoration. In the midst of Amos's mission, God gave him a new vision, not of destruction, but of hope, a promise that even a broken people could be made whole again. It was like a sunrise after a long, dark night, and Amos carried this light in his heart. In Amos 9:11, God declares, "In that day I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins." This wasn't just about buildings. It was about God's people. The shelter of David symbolized a time of pure faith, a closeness with God that Israel had lost. Amos saw a future where fields would overflow with grain, where families scattered by hardship would reunite, their laughter filling rebuilt cities. It was a vision of abundance, of God's love mending what sin had torn apart. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a family once driven from their home by injustice, now planting vineyards together, their children chasing each other through fields heavy with harvest. This was the hope Amos shared, a promise that God's justice would lead to healing. The people of Samaria had their own stories about such visions. They whispered that, when a prophet spoke of restoration, a rainbow would appear, a sign of God's unbreakable promise. Whether that rainbow shone for Amos, it captured the truth. God's mercy is as vast as his judgment. This vision of hope wasn't just for Israel. It was a seed planted for all time. How would Amos's words live on, shaping hearts across generations? Let's explore his lasting legacy. As Amos's voice faded from Samaria's streets, he stepped back into the shadows. Some say he returned to Tekoa, tending his sheep and fig trees under the same quiet hills where his journey began. Others believe he carried God's message to other corners, unnoticed by history. The Bible doesn't tell us how his story ended, but one thing is certain. Amos's words didn't fade. They took root like seeds scattered on fertile ground, growing into a legacy that echoes across centuries. Amos 5:24 remains his anthem. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. These words weren't just for Israel, they were for every heart that hears them. They inspired movements for justice, from the cries of the oppressed in ancient times to modern voices like Martin Luther King Jr., who echoed Amos's call for fairness and compassion. Amos showed us that God's heart beats for the forgotten, the poor, the marginalized, and that true faith isn't in grand rituals, but in lives that flow with justice and love. The people of Tekoa had their own stories about Amos's legacy. They said the hills where he once walked still whispered his words when injustice stirred, as if the wind carried his cry for righteousness. Some claimed the fig trees he tended bore fruit sweeter than any other, a sign that God's promise of restoration lived on. True or not, these tales remind us. Amos, a shepherd with no title, left a mark that time cannot erase. Amos's legacy challenges us today to be voices for justice, to live with courage. But how can we carry his message forward? Let's wrap up with a call to make his vision real in our world. We've walked with Amos from the quiet hills of Tekoa to the glittering streets of Samaria, from fiery visions of judgment to a radiant promise of restoration. His story, a shepherd chosen to speak God's truth, reminds us that no one is too ordinary to make a difference. Amos 3:8 says, "The Lord has spoken, who can but prophesy?" That was Amos's call, and in a way it's ours too. His cry for justice, for righteousness to flow like a never-failing stream, isn't locked in the pages of the Bible. It's a challenge for us right here, right now. Let me share something personal. A few months ago, I saw a coworker being unfairly treated at work. It wasn't easy, but I spoke up, inspired by Amos's courage to stand for what's right. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it made a difference. That's what Amos teaches us. Justice starts with small acts, helping a neighbor, speaking up for the voiceless, or simply listening to someone in need. The people of Tekoa believed that when you act on Amos's words, the winds of their hills whisper encouragement, as if his spirit cheers you on. Maybe that's just a story, but it reminds us. Every step toward justice carries God's blessing. If Amos's story has stirred something in you, let's keep his vision alive. Press that like button to spread his message. Share this video with someone who needs inspiration, and subscribe with the bell icon so you don't miss our next journey into the Bible's powerful stories. In the comments, tell us, what's one way you'll let justice flow in your world? And don't miss our next video, where we'll uncover another prophet who faced an empire with fearless faith. You won't believe what happens. Let's be like Amos. Ordinary people, extraordinary impact. Let justice flow.